The chamber was silent. Only the echo of boots on stone broke the stillness. In the centre of the room stood the gallows, wooden, stark and waiting. A young woman was led forward, her hands steady at her sides. She did not tremble. She did not look away. She was 22, blonde hair pulled neatly back, her face calm, almost detached, as though she were walking to a simple appointment and not to the end of her life. The British executioner adjusted the rope. The witnesses leaned forward, unable to reconcile what they were seeing. The notorious Irma Grese, known to survivors as the beautiful beast and the angel of death, looked impossibly young. When asked for her last words, she did not pray. She did not beg. She spoke one word, sharp and cold. Schnell. Quickly. The trapdoor opened, and history recorded the instant fall of one of the most infamous women of the Third Reich. But how does a farm girl from a small German village become a figure of such terror? How did a teenager who once dreamed of nursing transform into a symbol of cruelty, feared in every camp she walked through? Because Irma Grese was not simply a guard, she was a presence. Survivors remembered her whip, her mocking smile, the way she could decide life or death with nothing more than a flick of her hand. And yet, her story is not only about what she did in uniform, it is about the world that built her, a broken childhood, a home marked by grief, a system that promised certainty, order, and power to those who embraced its ruthless ideology. This is not the story of a hardened veteran. It is the story of a young woman who chose obedience over conscience, and whose choices left scars on thousands of lives. If you find this shocking already, hit subscribe so you don't miss the darker secrets ahead. Because the execution chamber was not the beginning, it was the ending, and before the rope snapped tight, before her name filled headlines across Europe, Irma Grese's life had already been defined by loss, obedience, and cruelty. But to understand how she reached the gallows, we must return to where it all began. A small village in northern Germany, and a 13-year-old girl left shattered by tragedy. Irma Ida Ilse Grese was born on October 7th, 1923, in the quiet village of Rechen in northern Germany. Life here was simple. Fields, woods, a handful of shops, and a family bound by strict discipline. Her father was a dairyman, hard-working, stern, a man who believed order was survival. In his home, feelings were rarely spoken, commands were followed. But beneath that rigid roof, another storm brewed. Her mother struggled with despair. To the neighbours, she appeared dutiful, carrying her share of farm work. But to her children, there were moments of deep silence and sudden tears. One day, when Irma was just 13, that silence became permanent. Her mother took her own life. The news spread quickly through the village. For the family, there was no time for softness, no space for grieving. Her father responded with even stricter rules. He believed sorrow was weakness. Irma learned, in those formative years, that emotions were dangerous, best hidden behind a still face. Classrooms offered her little comfort. Teachers described her as average, distracted, unwilling to pursue study. Books did not hold her. The world of farm work and duty pressed harder on her than dreams of learning ever could. By the age of 15, she left school. With no diploma, no direction, and no guidance, she turned to small jobs, cleaning, helping on farms, menial work that gave her coins but no purpose. It was a time when Germany itself was changing. Every radio, every poster promised a new order. Youth organisations filled village halls. They offered marching songs, uniforms, and the certainty that obedience could erase uncertainty. Irma, wounded by loss and desperate for belonging, began to listen. The stern lessons of her father and the silence left by her mother's absence made her eager to embrace anything that gave her identity, a place, a promise. And soon, she would find it. By the time she turned 15, Irma was already walking away from school and toward a destiny no one could have foreseen. For a brief moment, Irma's path seemed ordinary. After leaving school, she trained as a nurse. The uniform was crisp, the routines were clear, beds to make, patients to tend, orders to follow. But the work left her restless. Nursing demanded compassion, patience, the very qualities that grief and silence had drained from her childhood. Irma preferred the order of the uniform more than the care behind it. She wanted structure, recognition, something stronger than sympathy. Germany by then was not quiet. It pulsed with propaganda. The League of German Girls, the female wing of Hitler Youth, was everywhere. They gathered in village halls, sang marching songs, practiced discipline, and promised young women a place in the new world the Nazis were building. For Irma, it was intoxicating. She had felt invisible in school, unwanted in her own home. Here she was praised for obedience. Here her uniform made her someone. Nights in the village echoed with the hum of projectors. Propaganda films flickered across blank walls. They painted enemies to despise and ideals to worship. Girls sat in rows, faces glowing in the white light, learning that purity, sacrifice and service were their sacred duty. Irma absorbed every word. She learned that in this new Germany, obedience was not weakness, it was power. The movement spoke with the same authority her father once demanded, but now it offered reward, pride, certainty, belonging. Step by step, the girl who had once folded bedsheets in a nurse's dormitory was being remade, not into a healer, but into a servant of ideology. By 19, she had made her choice. She joined the SS Women's Auxiliary. Her first posting, Ravensbrück, the infamous women's concentration camp. There, she would no longer wear a nurse's white uniform. She would wear black. She would learn the signals, the commands, the chain of authority, and with that uniform came a weapon, a whip, and in her hand it would soon become a symbol of terror. At 19, Irma Grese donned the SS uniform and the whip that would make her infamous. The gates of Ravensbrück swung open with a clang of iron. This was no ordinary prison. It was the largest women's concentration camp in the Reich, an isolated world where discipline ruled every hour and cruelty was law. Here, Irma Grese began her true education. She arrived as a young auxiliary, her black SS uniform freshly pressed, her boots polished, her face composed. But inside these walls she would be taught the duties that transformed guards into instruments of terror. Roll calls were the first lesson. At dawn, prisoners were forced to line up in freezing air. If numbers didn't match, the women stood for hours. If one collapsed, others were punished. Irma watched. Then she learned to enforce. Her voice barked orders. Her hand carried the whip that cracked across backs to keep the line straight. Searches followed. A piece of bread hidden in a dress, a keepsake sewn into a hem. The punishment was swift. Beatings, loss of rations, confinement in dark cells. Irma discovered the unspoken rule of the camp. Mercy was weakness. Authority demanded control through fear. She mastered the reports, the signals, the salutes. Every action, no matter how brutal, was logged with cold efficiency. Her superiors noticed. Ravensbrück rewarded those who could impose order without hesitation, and Irma, eager to climb, proved herself quickly. Survivors later recalled her as detached. She rarely raised her voice in rage. Her punishments were delivered with eerie calm, as if cruelty had become routine. She was not a storm, she was the still air before it. For Irma, Ravensbrück was a proving ground. It was where she shed the last traces of ordinary girlhood, replacing them with the cold habits of power. Each day hardened her further. Each order she followed erased another fragment of doubt. She had learned the mechanics, roll call, work details, punishment, reports. But she had not yet reached her full infamy. Because soon, Irma Grese would be transferred to a place even darker, a place where death itself hung in the air. Ravensbrück was only the beginning. Her reputation would be forged in the shadow of Auschwitz. The train whistles cut through the night. Each arrival at Auschwitz-Birkenau brought thousands of prisoners, faces hollow with fear, bodies pressed against one another, eyes searching for answers that never came. And waiting on the platform was Irma Grese. By the time she arrived at Auschwitz, Irma was no longer a trainee. She had risen to the rank of Oberaufseherin, senior female supervisor. It was one of the highest positions a woman could hold within the SS camp system. And with that promotion came immense power. Witnesses remembered her presence instantly. She wore a pistol at her hip, a whip in her hand, and a mocking smile that chilled even the most hardened prisoners. She was barely in her 20s, yet she walked with the authority of someone who could decide life, or death, with a single gesture. Her duties went beyond the walls of the women's camp. She conducted inspections, where prisoners were forced to strip in freezing weather as she mocked their shaved heads and scarred bodies. She punished the smallest infractions, an untied shoe, a missed button, a stolen scrap of bread. Survivors recalled her punishments as deliberate, never sudden bursts of rage. They were measured, precise, meant to humiliate and destroy. But most chilling of all were the selections. On the arrival platform, she stood beside SS doctors and officers. With nothing more than a flick of her hand, she directed thousands of women and children to the left or the right. One side meant forced labour, the other meant the gas chambers. Prisoners described her movements as mechanical, almost casual, a nod of her chin, a turn of her wrist. The decisions that sealed countless fates came without hesitation, without pause. Those who survived spoke of the way she laughed at the weak, set dogs on those who stumbled, and used her whip to keep lines moving. Her violence was not a matter of discipline alone. It was a performance of domination. In the camp hierarchy, Irma became a figure of fear. Other guards looked to her as an example of efficiency, and prisoners saw in her face the embodiment of pitiless cruelty. One survivor remembered a winter roll call. Snow lay across the mud. Hundreds of women stood in wooden shoes and thin dresses. A prisoner collapsed in the line. Irma stepped forward, glanced down at the fallen figure and pointed. The woman was dragged aside and the count began again. Day after day she repeated these routines until cruelty became indistinguishable from duty. But whispers spread even among her own colleagues. Some SS members remarked that she went too far, that her extremes stood out even in a system designed for brutality. Irma Grese had become a name to fear in Auschwitz, yet her power and her infamy were far from over. Because as the Reich began to crumble, she would be sent to another camp, where her cruelty would leave one final unforgettable mark. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling. Fronts collapsed under Allied pressure. Trains stopped. Orders broke down. Camps were shuffled in desperation as the regime tried to hide what could no longer be hidden. Irma Grese was transferred to Bergen-Belsen. If Auschwitz had been a machine of death, Bergen-Belsen was chaos incarnate. There were no gas chambers here, but there was something just as merciless: starvation, disease, and despair. When Grese arrived, she stepped into a world already broken. The camp was overcrowded beyond imagining. Tens of thousands of prisoners lay crammed into wooden barracks or sprawled on the ground. Typhus raged unchecked. The stench of rot filled the air, carried by wind across open fields. The dead and the living existed side by side, bodies stacked in piles waiting for burial that never came. And still, Irma enforced her authority. Witnesses described her walking the campgrounds in her uniform, whip in hand, even as the world around her collapsed. Prisoners, skeletal and sick, were forced to line up at her command. She barked orders with the same cold voice she'd used at Auschwitz. There was no mercy, no shift in her methods, even as the Reich itself burned. But Bergen-Belsen was different in one crucial way. It was not hidden. In April 1945, British troops pushed through the gates. What they found shocked the world. They walked among heaps of corpses. They saw thousands of prisoners near death, starving, diseased, and too weak to stand. Bulldozers were brought in to dig mass graves. Field hospitals overflowed with the emaciated survivors, and among it all they found the SS staff who had ruled this place. Irma Grese did not run. She did not disguise herself. She gave her name calmly when questioned. Prisoners pointed at her instantly, crying out in anger, in fear, in recognition. The British officers recorded it: name, rank, duties, and she was placed under arrest. Photographers soon arrived. Their lenses captured her youthful face, blonde hair pulled back, eyes steady. To the world, it was almost incomprehensible. One of the most feared guards of the camps looked barely older than a schoolgirl. And within days, her image was everywhere. Newspapers carried her face across Britain and beyond, introducing Irma Grese as one of the most notorious guards ever captured. The war was over, the camps were liberated, but justice had only just begun. In September 1945, a British military tribunal convened in the city of Lüneburg. The case would come to be known as the Belsen trial. In the dock sat 45 defendants, guards and officials from Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Among them was Irma Grese. She was dressed not in her SS uniform now, but in a plain suit. Her hair neatly tied back. Her face, witnesses said, was calm. Too calm, as though she were waiting for another routine inspection instead of a judgment on crimes against humanity. The courtroom was packed. Survivors sat on wooden benches, their frail bodies still marked by years of starvation. Members of the press filled every corner, pens scratching, cameras snapping, eager to capture the image of a young woman whose name already stirred outrage across Europe. The charges were read: murder, brutality, participation in selections at Auschwitz, cruelty at Bergen-Belsen. Irma's response: a flat denial. She insisted she was only following orders, a cog in a larger machine. She claimed she never beat prisoners, never chose who went to the gas. She said her whip was only for discipline, not pain. But the witnesses told another story. One after another, survivors stepped forward. They pointed across the courtroom, to her. They spoke of the roll calls she commanded when women collapsed from exhaustion, and she ordered them beaten. They described the whip that lashed across faces and backs, often without warning. They remembered the selections where her gestures sent mothers and children to their deaths. Some recalled her unleashing dogs on those too weak to walk. Their voices trembled with anger, with grief, but also with certainty. Every testimony built the same picture: a young woman who carried cruelty like a second skin. The defense pressed her age, just 22. They argued she lacked real authority, that she had no power to decide life or death. But the survivors refused to bend. They had lived under her shadow. They remembered the smirk on her face, the sting of her whip, the finality of her gestures. The press reported daily. Headlines described her as the beautiful beast. Photographs of her calm expression circulated widely. Readers struggled to reconcile her youth with the horrors attributed to her. How could someone so young command such fear? Through it all, Irma Grese sat straight-backed, eyes fixed on the judges. Witnesses wept. Reporters gasped. But she showed no trace of regret. And when the final day of judgment came, November 17th, 1945, the courtroom fell silent. The verdict was read. Guilty. The sentence, death by hanging. Irma Grese, at just 22 years old, had become the youngest woman executed for war crimes in the 20th century. When the verdict came, it sealed not just her fate, but her place in history. After the verdict was read, Irma Grese was transferred to Hamelin Prison. It was here, behind thick stone walls and iron doors, that she would spend her final weeks. Her cell was small. Bare stone, a wooden bed, a table, a bucket. A place meant not for living, but for waiting. And yet, those who guarded her noticed something unsettling. She remained calm, always calm. Each day she folded her clothes neatly. She kept her blanket smooth and her cell in order, as though tidiness could give meaning to the silence that pressed against the walls. She ate her meals without complaint. She followed instructions without hesitation. Prison officers watched for cracks in her composure. A breakdown. Tears. Pleas for mercy. They saw none. There were no letters of remorse, no desperate appeals. When a chaplain came to offer prayers, she listened politely, but gave no sign of comfort or repentance. Other condemned prisoners paced their cells, prayed endlessly, or clung to any last hope of clemency. Irma did not. To the guards, it was as though she had already accepted her place in history, not as a victim, not as a woman broken by fate, but as a figure who would walk steadily to her end, just as she had once walked across the camp roll calls with whip in hand. There was no fear, no regret, only the same cold composure that had defined her years in uniform. But time cannot be held at bay forever. Because on the morning of December the 13th, 1945, the calm in Irma Grese's cell would end forever. The morning of December the 13th, 1945 was cold and still. Inside Hamelin Prison, footsteps echoed down narrow corridors. Guards moved with solemn precision, their duty clear. In one of the cells, Irma Grese rose to her feet. She dressed in plain prison clothes, her hair pulled back. Her movements, as always, were calm. She folded her blanket one final time, smoothing the fabric with deliberate care. The warder read her sentence aloud once more. She listened quietly, then nodded. There was no plea for mercy, no trembling voice, no tears. The short walk to the execution chamber began. 2 guards flanked her, their boots striking against stone. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy wooden door. Beyond it, the gallows awaited. Britain's chief executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, was already there. He had carried out many hangings before. Calm, efficient, methodical. Every measurement had been taken the day before. The rope was cut to length, the trap tested, the drop calculated to ensure swiftness. Grese stepped onto the platform. The witnesses noted her composure, her head held high, her stride steady. Even now, at 22 years old, she did not falter. Pierrepoint asked if she had any last words. She turned her face slightly, her voice sharp, almost impatient. Schnell. Quickly. The word cut the silence like a blade. Pierrepoint placed the white hood over her head. He adjusted the noose around her neck. He stepped back. At his signal, the trapdoor opened. The platform dropped. In an instant, Irma Grese's life was over. The doctor confirmed death within minutes. Her body was lowered into a simple wooden coffin, the final resting place for one of the most infamous figures of the camps. Outside the prison, The town went about its mourning unaware of the exact moment history had shifted. Only those present in the chamber would carry the memory of how calmly she had met the rope. Yet death did not erase her. Her name would live on in infamy. At just 22 years old, Irma Grese's life ended beneath the gallows. But her story did not end there. She remains one of the most infamous women of the Nazi regime, not because of her age alone, but because of what that age represents. When we think of atrocity, we imagine hardened generals, seasoned killers, men shaped by decades of war. But Irma was barely more than a girl when she rose to power. She did not inherit cruelty from years of violence. She chose it, step by step, through obedience, through ambition, through a willingness to place ideology above humanity. That is what makes her story so chilling. It proves that evil is not always old. It is not always distant. It can take root in the young, in the ordinary, in those desperate to belong. Irma was not born a monster. She was made one, shaped by propaganda, rewarded for brutality, elevated by a system that demanded loyalty above conscience. She embraced it eagerly, and in doing so she became a weapon of terror in some of history's darkest places. Survivors never forgot her. They remembered the whip in her hand, the mocking smile, the gestures that meant life or death. And when her trial came, their voices ensured she would never be forgotten. But remembering her is not about preserving her name. It is about preserving the warning. Because history is not only the record of what happened, it is the mirror of what can happen again when power, obedience and cruelty are given a stage. Irma Grese's story is that mirror. It shows us how quickly ordinary life can collapse into horror, how quickly youth can be weaponized, how quickly conscience can be silenced when obedience is praised. She was executed in 1945, but her name, her actions and her choices remain a symbol of what happens when humanity is surrendered to ideology. If this story shook you, make sure to like and comment so I know you want more stories like this one. Because the true legacy of Irma Grese is not just her crimes, it is the lesson her life leaves behind, that fear, obedience and blind loyalty can turn even the young into instruments of terror.